If there is no self, who becomes enlightened? We often find ourselves caught in a web of questions, especially when exploring the heart of spiritual understanding. One question that comes up again and again, particularly in Buddhist teachings, is this: if there is no self, then who becomes enlightened? It's a natural question, and on the surface, it seems straightforward. But like a reflection in a still pond, this question itself can show us how we see ourselves in the world. Part 1. The Illusion of Who. Let's look closer. The way we ask this question, who, already assumes a real someone, a constant I that goes through enlightenment. It's like thinking there's a permanent person in charge of all life's changes. But this is the very illusion the Buddha's teachings try to help us see through. In a conversation with his close disciple Ananda, the Buddha pointed out this misunderstanding. He explained that the idea of a who seeking enlightenment is like trying to catch a shadow. There is no permanent who, no unchanging person. It's a concept, a story we tell ourselves, not a solid thing. The question itself, therefore, perpetuates the illusion it attempts to explore. By assuming a permanent entity, we get trapped in the illusory dream of self. Why do we have this illusion of a self? The Buddha taught that it comes from ignorance, not understanding reality. This ignorance leads to craving and attachment. We crave things that we think will make our self feel good, and cling to them, trying to make them permanent. And we end up with a strong attachment to I, me, and mine. It's like mistaking a mirage for an oasis, constantly chasing something that can't be found. Instead of focusing on this who, the Buddha encourages us to look at the ever-changing nature of existence. He used powerful images. He said, "Just as the wind blows, but there is no permanent wind, consciousness arises, but there is no permanent consciousness. Like the wind, just movement of air, our thoughts, feelings, and awareness are not fixed, solid, or lasting. They come and go, like waves in the ocean. There isn't an unchanging self that owns or controls them. Our idea of self is like a river, always changing, always flowing. We tend to confuse the interplay of 5 elements, known as the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, for a solid, unchanging self. These aggregates are like a car's parts. Each is important, but none are the car. Form is the physical body itself. Feelings are the pleasant or unpleasant sensations we experience. Perception is how we make sense of feelings. Mental formations are our thoughts, intentions, and habits. And consciousness is simply awareness. They work together and create a sense of self. But this self isn't permanent. It's just a temporary experience. Let's look at a practical example. Say we have a pain in our leg. This is form, followed by a feeling pain. Then our mind perceives that feeling, and we tell a story. And the story guides our actions. We might wonder how bad the pain is, if it will last, what happens if it gets worse, etc. The pain is there, a feeling, and triggers a thought, which leads to more thoughts. It can be endless. We might even imagine negative scenarios. And there is always awareness. Awareness witnesses all this happening. But this whole process is not done by anyone. It just happens by itself, without a central controller or doer. The Buddha described these aggregates as fleeting. Form is like foam, feeling like a bubble, perception like a mirage. Think of how quickly foam disappears, how bubbles burst, and how mirages vanish. They're not solid. And the self we cling to is just as impermanent. Our experiences are real, like ocean waves, but they're always changing. They don't make a permanent wave. When we start to see through this illusion, another way of experiencing life opens up. We start to notice awareness itself, which is pure knowing. This pure knowing isn't someone understanding, but the innate openness that allows experience to unfold. It's like the clear sky where clouds appear and disappear. The sky remains the same. Our awareness is that vast openness, not a void, but the potential for all things to arise and dissolve. It's the spaciousness that allows thoughts, feelings, and sensations to come and go. Awareness isn't a thing or a person. It's simply this openness, and there isn't anyone aware of it. It just is. It is the nature of reality, freedom itself. By seeing through the illusion of a permanent self, we can begin to approach the answer of who becomes enlightened. This then opens to the path of freedom. Part 2. The process of awakening without a self. So, we've been exploring this idea of no self and how the question, who becomes enlightened itself, can be a bit of a trap. It keeps us focused on a permanent I, which, as we've seen, isn't really there. Now, the question becomes, if there's no self, then how does this whole enlightenment thing even happen? If there's no who, what's the process? It's like asking how a flower blooms if there's no one making it bloom. The answer, in Buddhist teachings, lies in understanding conditions, the way things happen, and the nature of experience itself. The Buddhist teachings on dependent origination provide us with a map. This is a principle that says everything arises because of other things. It's like a chain reaction where one thing leads to another. Nothing exists independently. It's a concept that shows us that nothing is fixed. It is also something that helps us understand how enlightenment happens, and it's very different than the idea of someone becoming enlightened. It's like a change in weather. The rain doesn't happen by anyone's effort. The conditions simply come together, and the rain just happens by itself. In the same way, enlightenment isn't something that a self does. It arises when the conditions are right. Enlightenment isn't done by a self, but is a natural arising of understanding. One of the most important conditions for awakening is the falling away of ignorance. It's not that someone is forcing the ignorance to stop or to go away. It's more like the clouds clearing to reveal the sun. The sun has always been there. It didn't require any effort to exist. And the moment the clouds disappear, the sun's light is apparent. Similarly, when we start to see things clearly, we see through the illusion of self. The understanding that there isn't a permanent I allows for the space to see more clearly. This understanding is like a key that unlocks the door to a new way of experiencing life. So, how do we see this in actual experience? It begins with observation. We start by paying close attention to what's happening within our own minds. We start to observe the nature of our thoughts, watching how they arise, how they linger for a bit, and how they fade away. It's like watching bubbles in a stream. Each one pops up, floats for a moment, and then disappears. We don't have to do anything. We simply notice. We begin to see the impermanence of our thoughts, their constant movement and change. Thoughts are just thoughts, not who we are. When we observe our thoughts with curiosity, we discover something surprising. We start to notice a space between thoughts, a pause, a silence, where there are no thoughts. This silence isn't empty. It is full of awareness. It is the spaciousness where wisdom can naturally shine. It's like the space between the notes in a melody, without which there would be no music. This space is always there, but we tend to miss it because we are always so caught up in our thoughts. By simply noticing that space, without trying to control it or analyze it, our awareness has the chance to expand. The space between thoughts isn't a meaningless void, but a space of pure potential, where pure awareness is present. In the Majjhima Nikaya, the Buddha told his monks that when one sees this as it is, with right discernment, all ideas of I and mine vanish. This is not an act of will, but rather a natural unfolding. It's like the sun rising in the morning when the conditions are right. The sun has always been there. It simply shows up when the clouds are gone. In the same way, understanding happens by itself when the conditions are right, when ignorance fades away. When we no longer cling to the idea of a permanent self, the space for wisdom appears naturally. It's not about forcing anything, it's about allowing wisdom to emerge. This isn't a passive state, but a way of being in the world. The effort comes from observing. Observation here is not a passive state, but an active, non-judgmental attention that helps us see the true nature of reality. When we observe, we gain a deeper understanding of the way things are. The process of awakening is more like a shift in perception. It is when our awareness of life expands. It's a change that occurs naturally when we see the truth of impermanence, no self, and dependent origination. It isn't something that a self does. It's more like a flower opening when the sun rises. It's always been there. The potential for it has always been there. The understanding comes from simply observing our mind and the nature of our experience. It isn't about doing, it's about seeing. To see the truth is to see through the illusion. Part 3. Liberation through Understanding. So, we've looked at the illusion of a self and how the question, who becomes enlightened, can be misleading. We've also explored how awakening occurs through understanding conditions and observing the nature of our experience. Now, we come to the final piece of the puzzle. What happens when this understanding dawns? What is the result of seeing through the illusion of self? In Buddhist teachings, it is described as liberation, a freedom from suffering that comes from seeing the way things truly are. This liberation isn't a far-off goal that we achieve after a long struggle. It's actually the spontaneous unfolding of wisdom. The Buddha used a beautiful image to explain this process. He said, "The Dhamma carries away the practitioner. It's like a river carrying a boat downstream. You don't have to force the river to flow. It simply does what it does organically." Similarly, when we see through delusion, when the illusion of self is seen for what it is, wisdom unfolds by itself. We start to understand life differently. It's as though our eyes have been opened to see a reality that was always there, but we couldn't see it before. This understanding is not a mental concept, but a direct recognition of something that's always here: awareness. We begin to recognize that our awareness is already free from self. It's like the sky, which is always clear and open, regardless of the clouds that pass through it. Our awareness is that spaciousness. It's always present and is never touched by our thoughts, feelings, or experiences. It's not something we have to create. It's something we simply recognize. We can then begin to live from that recognition. This recognition is the immediacy of liberation in each moment. It's not something we achieve in the future, but something that's available now. It's like discovering that the gold you've been searching for was already in your pocket all along. We just weren't aware of it. Liberation isn't an event that happens after years of practice, but a direct understanding that is accessible every moment when we are not caught in our thoughts. It's the understanding that we are already free in our essential nature. This shift in perception is a radical transformation. Living from this clarity is the natural expression of wisdom without a wise person. It's like a tree that spontaneously bears fruit. It doesn't have to try to be fruitful. In the same way, when we live from our true nature, we spontaneously express qualities like compassion, kindness, and joy. We don't have to try to be good. Goodness just flows from us. It's a life lived directly without the medium of me. This means we meet life's challenges and joys without the filter of a self that has to be protected or that has to be made happy. We start to live from a place of open awareness. This doesn't mean that we become passive or that we don't care about the world. In fact, it's quite the opposite. We are more engaged and connected to life when we are not consumed by our own personal desires and fears. We start to see the world and others with more clarity and compassion. We're no longer driven by the need to fulfill a self, and instead we are guided by our natural wisdom. It's living in a way that is both grounded and expansive, compassionate and wise. Finally, the Buddha's last teaching to his disciples was about diligence. He didn't say it was about achieving enlightenment. He said it was about being diligent. Practice unfolds organically when the truth is seen. This means that we continue to observe our mind. We continue to cultivate awareness. We continue to act with kindness, but we do so without an agenda or a desire to achieve something. It's about letting go of the idea of a practitioner and simply allowing the practice itself to happen. There is no me practicing. There is only practice. It is simply life unfolding itself. And when we see this clearly, we realize our true nature is already free. There isn't someone that becomes free. There is only freedom.